Judge humiliates woman in court. Regrets it after learning her identity. Judge Robert Mallory adjusted his black robe for the 100th time that morning, a habit he developed over his 23 years on the bench. The fabric felt heavier than usual today, probably because he'd barely slept last night. His daughter's college acceptance letters were due any day now, and the waiting game was wearing him thin. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. The morning sun leaked through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across his desk. Another Monday, another packed docket. He thumbed through the stack of cases waiting for him, each manila folder representing someone's problems he'd have to solve. Or dismiss. Usually dismiss. Your Honor, his clerk, Tim, poked his head through the door. We're ready when you are. Mallory nodded, gathering his reading glasses from their worn leather case. How many today? 15 before lunch. Mostly small claims and civil disputes. The judge couldn't hide his grimace. These were the cases he hated most: petty neighbors fighting over fence lines, amateur landlords trying to justify illegal evictions, people thinking they could lawyer their way through life without actual lawyers. Back in his early days, he'd found these cases fascinating, each one a tiny window into human nature. Now they just felt like speed bumps on his road to retirement. Let's get it over with, he muttered, following Tim into the courtroom. The familiar smell of wood polish and anxiety hit him as he entered. The gallery was already filling up with the day's parade of faces. Worried, angry, hopeful, defeated. They all looked the same to him now. He'd seen too many to count, heard too many stories that started with "Your Honor, you don't understand," and ended with him understanding perfectly well that someone was wasting his time. The bailiff's voice rang out. All rise. The Superior Court of the 4th District is now in session, the Honorable Judge Robert Mallory presiding. Mallory took his seat, adjusting his microphone with practiced precision. The wooden chair creaked. He'd been asking for a new one for months, but budget cuts meant he'd probably retire before that happened. He scanned the room, his eyes skipping over the faces like stones across a pond. Be seated, he said, his voice carrying that perfect blend of authority and boredom that came from decades of repetition. Tim, what's first on the docket? The first 3 cases went exactly as he expected. A dispute over a damaged rental property, settled in 10 minutes with a payment plan. A contract disagreement between a wedding photographer and an unhappy bride, dismissed with instructions to work it out like adults. A small business owner trying to collect on an unpaid invoice, judgment for the plaintiff. Next case. Mallory checked his watch. Not even 10 o'clock, and he already felt the familiar headache creeping in. He reached for his water glass, finding it empty. Before he could signal Tim, the young clerk was already approaching with a fresh pitcher. At least someone in this room was doing their job properly. The morning dragged on, each case blending into the next. Mallory found himself playing his favorite courtroom game, guessing the outcome before anyone spoke. 23 years had taught him that most cases followed predictable patterns. The nervous ones usually had something to hide. The overly confident ones usually had terrible cases. The quiet ones could go either way, but they rarely surprised him. During a brief recess, he retreated to his chambers, loosening his collar and staring out the window at the city below. The view hadn't changed much over the years. Same buildings, same traffic, same pigeons fighting over scraps on the courthouse steps. Sometimes he wondered if he'd made the right choice, taking the judgeship instead of staying in private practice. The money would have been better, that was certain. But there was something about wearing the robe, about being the final word in his courtroom, that still satisfied some deep part of him. His phone buzzed, a text from his wife. Any word from Stanford yet? He typed back a quick no and put the phone away. The acceptance letters were supposed to come this week, and his daughter's future hung in the balance. He tried not to let it distract him, but every time his mind wandered, it went straight to those unopened envelopes. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session loomed ahead like a marathon he hadn't trained for. The gallery had thinned out somewhat. Some cases settled during lunch, others postponed. The remaining faces looked wearier now, worn down by hours of waiting. Mallory knew the feeling. He'd stopped reading the case summaries in detail years ago. Experience had taught him that most cases could be understood in the first 30 seconds of testimony. People telegraphed their intentions, their lies, their desperation. He developed a sixth sense for it, or so he liked to think. "Next case," he called out, not bothering to look up from his notes. The shuffling of feet and rustling of papers filled the courtroom as the next parties approached the podium. Another dispute, another decision, another day in the life of Judge Robert Mallory. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting different shadows now. The courtroom felt warmer, stuffier. Someone coughed in the gallery. That dry, nervous cough people get when they're about to speak in public. Mallory resisted the urge to check his watch again. Tim appeared at his side with another stack of files. "These just came in from filing, Your Honor. They'll need to be added to tomorrow's docket." Mallory suppressed a sigh. More cases, more problems, more people convinced their issues were the most important things in the world. He remembered his old mentor's words. A judge's job isn't to solve everyone's problems. It's to decide which problems actually need solving. At the time, it had seemed cynical. Now it felt like wisdom. The afternoon cases rolled by in their usual parade. A fender bender turned personal vendetta. A homeowners association dispute about unapproved garden gnomes. A contractor who'd abandoned a job halfway through. Mallory handled them all with the same efficient detachment, his rulings coming as automatically as breathing. His mind wandered to his early days as a judge, when he'd agonized over every decision, spent hours researching precedents, written lengthy opinions even for minor cases. Young Judge Mallory had been determined to change the world from his bench, to make every ruling count. Old Judge Mallory knew better. The world didn't change. It just filed more lawsuits. The bailiff announced the next case, and Mallory barely registered the names. Another civil suit, another David versus Goliath story, another waste of his time. He'd heard it all before, seen it all before. Nothing surprised him anymore, and that was exactly how he liked it. As the day wound down, the remaining cases felt like weights around his neck. Each one represented more time away from home, more decisions to make, more problems to solve or dismiss. The young woman approaching the podium now looked like just another face in the endless parade, another story he'd forget as soon as she left his courtroom. Little did he know, this case would be different. This unassuming woman would shake the foundations of his carefully ordered world. But for now, she was just another name on his docket, another case to be handled with the same efficient dismissiveness he'd perfected over 2 decades on the bench. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound he'd stopped noticing years ago but sometimes crept back into his awareness during these late afternoon sessions. The courtroom deputy stifled a yawn, and Mallory felt his own exhaustion mirrored in the action. Just a few more cases, he told himself. Just a few more problems to solve, and then he could go home to wait for those college letters with the rest of his family. Elena Reyes clutched her worn leather bag closer to her chest as she approached the podium. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her papers, the sound of shuffling documents echoing through the courtroom. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, though looking at her now, you wouldn't know it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, with loose strands falling around her face. She'd been up since 4 a.m. reviewing her notes one last time, and hadn't bothered with anything more than a quick shower. Her navy blue blazer, bought secondhand for this very occasion, hung slightly loose on her frame. Sleep had been a luxury she couldn't afford lately, not with everything at stake. On the opposite side of the courtroom sat 3 men in expensive suits, representatives from Clayton Industries. They barely glanced her way, busy typing on their tablets and whispering to each other. Their confidence filled the room like a heavy cologne, the kind of assurance that came with having a team of corporate lawyers on speed dial. "State your name for the record," Judge Mallory said, not bothering to look up from his papers. "Elena Reyes, Your Honor." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The hours practicing in front of her bathroom mirror had paid off, at least for those 3 words. "And you're representing yourself in this matter?" There was that tone, the one she'd been warned about. The slight edge of dismissal, the unspoken judgment about another pro-se litigant wasting the court's time. "Yes, Your Honor." Elena straightened her shoulders, remembering her mother's words. "Stand tall. even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared. The judge finally looked up, peering at her over his reading glasses. His expression reminded her of her high school principal, that same mix of boredom and mild irritation. Ms. Reyes, you understand you're filing a civil suit against Clayton Industries, one of the largest employers in this district. I do, Your Honor. Elena reached for her first exhibit, her fingers steady now. The familiar weight of the documents grounded her. These papers represented months of research, countless sleepless nights, and the hopes of her entire neighborhood. But before she could begin her opening statement, Judge Mallory cut in. Ms. Reyes, this court's time is valuable. I've reviewed your complaint and, frankly, I'm not seeing sufficient evidence to proceed. These are serious allegations you're making. Elena felt her throat tighten. She'd expected resistance, but not this quick dismissal. The corporate lawyers shifted in their seats, poorly concealed smirks playing at their lips. They'd seen this before, probably dozens of times. Little people trying to take on the giant, getting swatted down before they could even speak. Your Honor, if I could just present my evidence. Ms. Reyes, Judge Mallory interrupted, his voice carrying that special kind of patience reserved for children and people he thought were wasting his time. Do you have any actual proof of these environmental violations? Any expert testimony? Any official reports? The papers in Elena's hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She had proof, pages and pages of it. Water samples, soil tests, health surveys from the neighborhood. But the judge's tone made it clear he'd already decided what kind of case this was, what kind of person she was. Behind her, she could hear the soft murmur of the gallery. Most days, these environmental cases barely drew an audience, but today was different. A few of her neighbors had taken time off work to come support her. Mrs. Chun from the corner house, whose garden had withered mysteriously last summer. Mr. Rodriguez, whose kids couldn't play outside anymore without getting headaches. They'd trusted her to be their voice, and here she was, being dismissed before she could even speak. The corporate lawyers exchanged knowing glances. One of them, the oldest of the three, didn't even try to hide his yawn. They'd probably planned their victory lunch already, expecting this to be wrapped up before noon. Just another day at the office for them, another small nuisance dealt with efficiently. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her community's trust pressing down on her shoulders. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound that seemed to grow louder in the uncomfortable silence. She thought about her kitchen table at home, covered in documents and research papers, each one telling a piece of the story that Judge Mallory didn't want to hear. Your Honor, she tried again, her voice stronger now, fueled by months of watching her neighborhood suffer. I have documented evidence of systematic violations of environmental safety regulations by Clayton Industries. The impact on our community. Ms. Reyes, Judge Mallory cut in again, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. This court sees dozens of cases like yours every month. People who think they've uncovered some grand conspiracy, who think they can take on major corporations without proper legal representation. The dismissiveness in his voice stung, but Elena stood her ground. She thought about the folder in her bag, the one containing the preliminary report from Dr. Martinez. The environmental expert had agreed to review her data as a favor to a former colleague, and his findings had confirmed her worst fears. But she couldn't reveal that yet. Timing was everything. One of the Clayton lawyers cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may, we have a motion to dismiss ready. Ms. Reyes's complaints are clearly without merit, and frankly, this entire proceeding is. I haven't finished presenting my case, Elena interjected, surprising herself with her firmness. A few eyebrows raised in the gallery. The corporate lawyers looked mildly annoyed, like someone had interrupted their golf game. Judge Mallory's expression darkened slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like they'd bought their court outfit from a thrift store. Ms. Reyes, I'm trying to save you some time here. These kinds of cases require substantial evidence, expert testimony, and typically actual legal representation. Elena felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. I understand that, Your Honor. And if you'll allow me to present my evidence, I believe you'll see that this case has merit. She could feel the weight of the judge's stare, the silent assessment happening behind those reading glasses. To him, She probably looked like every other desperate plaintiff who'd stood at this podium, underprepared, overwhelmed, in over their head. The kind of case he could dismiss before lunch and forget about by dinner. The corporate lawyers were already packing up their tablets, confident in their victory. The oldest one, probably a partner at their firm, didn't even bother to hide his relief. These kinds of cases were beneath him, his expression seemed to say. A waste of his billable hours. But they didn't know what Elena had in her bag. They hadn't seen the water samples, hadn't read Dr. Martinez's preliminary findings, hadn't talked to the families whose children were getting sick. They saw what they wanted to see. A young woman in a cheap blazer, probably some environmental activist trying to make a name for herself. Judge Mallory shuffled some papers on his bench, the sound echoing in the quiet courtroom. Ms. Reyes, I'm going to give you one last opportunity to convince me this case deserves this court's time. But I must warn you, if you're just here to make accusations without substantial evidence. He left the threat hanging in the air, but Elena understood. One shot, that's all she had. One chance to make him see past his prejudices, past her appearance, past his assumptions about what kind of case this was. She reached into her bag, fingers brushing past the preliminary reports to find the photos she'd taken last month. Sometimes she'd learned you had to tell the story backward to make people listen. Judge Mallory leaned back in his chair, making it creak in protest. He'd seen enough photos of muddy water and dead plants in his career to last a lifetime. Every environmental case came with the same dramatic evidence, pictures that could mean anything, presented as if they were smoking guns. Ms. Reyes, he said, not bothering to hide his impatience, a few photographs of discolored water hardly constitute evidence of corporate negligence. Elena's fingers tightened around the photos. Your Honor, these were taken over a 6-month period, showing the progressive contamination of… Yes. He waved his hand dismissively. I'm sure you have a whole timeline prepared, but do you have any actual scientific analysis? Any certified environmental impact studies? He knew she didn't. These cases were all the same, big on accusations, short on substance. The corporate lawyers exchanged amused glances. The youngest one, probably fresh out of law school, actually smirked. His older colleague nudged him slightly. They knew better than to show their satisfaction too openly. If I could just explain the pattern we've documented, Elena persisted, her voice steady despite the judge's interruption. She pulled out a map of her neighborhood, carefully marked with reds, indicating reported health issues. Judge Mallory felt his patience wearing thin. Ms. Reyes, this court doesn't run on patterns and personal observations. We deal in facts, in expert testimony, in actual evidence. I understand that, Your Honor, Elena said, pulling another document from her folder. Which is why I've also brought Ms. Reyes. He cut her off again, his voice sharp enough to make several people in the gallery straighten in their seats. I'm beginning to think you don't understand how this works. You can't just walk into my courtroom with a folder full of amateur research and expect to take on a corporation of this size. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the soft whoosh of the courtroom's air conditioning. Elena stood perfectly still, her hand frozen halfway to her bag. The corporate lawyers had stopped pretending to review their documents, now openly watching the exchange with poorly concealed satisfaction. Your Honor, Elena began again, her voice quieter but no less determined, I'm not here to waste the court's time. Our community has been tracking these issues systematically for over a year. We have documented evidence of, we? Judge Mallory interrupted, latching onto the word. And who exactly is we, Ms. Reyes? Some local environmental group? A Facebook community? A bunch of neighbors who got together and decided to play detectives? His words drew a few chuckles from the corporate side of the courtroom. Elena felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her spine straight. The folder in her hands contained proof of everything she was claiming: water analysis reports, soil samples, health surveys. But every time she tried to present them, the judge cut her off, his prejudice as solid as the wooden bench he sat behind. Your Honor, one of the Clayton lawyers stood up, straightening his expensive tie. If I may? It seems clear that Ms. Reyes, while undoubtedly well-intentioned, has no real basis for these allegations. We move for immediate dismissal. Judge Mallory nodded, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Ms. Reyes, do you have any response to the defense's motion? Any actual evidence you'd like to present? And by evidence, I mean something more substantial than photographs and amateur surveys. Elena felt something shift inside her. The patronizing tone, the dismissive glances, the assumption that she was just another nuisance to be swept aside, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. She'd expected this, prepared for it, but the reality of facing such blatant prejudice still took her breath away. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her, "I understand that you've likely seen many cases like this. People coming in with complaints against big corporations, maybe not always with the strongest evidence." Judge Mallory's eyebrows rose slightly, probably surprised she wasn't immediately launching into another attempt to present her evidence. The corporate lawyers shifted in their seats, suddenly less certain about where this was going. "But," Elena continued, "I wonder if your assumption about what kind of case this is, what kind of person I am, has prevented you from actually hearing what I'm trying to present." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Mallory's face darkened. "Ms. Reyes, you're treading on dangerous ground. This court, Elena pressed on, her heart hammering but her voice steady, is supposed to hear evidence before making judgments. Yet you've interrupted me 7 times in the past 15 minutes, each time before I could present any substantial evidence." The corporate lawyers were no longer smirking. The oldest one was writing something furiously on his legal pad, while the others watched the exchange with growing concern. This wasn't following their usual script. Judge Mallory's fingers drummed against his bench. "Ms. Reyes, I've given you multiple opportunities to present your evidence. Instead, you seem intent on questioning this court's integrity." "No, Your Honor," Elena replied, reaching into her bag one more time. "I'm simply asking for the opportunity to present my case without prejudgment. The same opportunity that the lawyers from Clayton Industries would receive." The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees. Judge Mallory leaned forward, his face flushed with anger. "Ms. Reyes, let me be very clear. Your insinuations about this court's fairness are not only inappropriate but potentially contemptuous. If you have evidence, present it now. Otherwise, I'll have no choice but to dismiss this case." Elena pulled out a thick manila envelope, sealed and marked with official stamps. The corporate lawyer's eyes followed her movement, their previous confidence wavering slightly. She placed it on the podium, her hand steady. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent courtroom, "I came here today knowing exactly what to expect. I knew you'd see me as just another nuisance case. I knew you'd assume I was unprepared, uninformed, and unworthy of your time." Judge Mallory's face was turning an interesting shade of red, but Elena continued before he could interrupt again. "That's why I documented everything, not just the environmental violations, but also every attempt to silence our community, every dismissal of our concerns, every assumption made about our credibility before we could even speak." The gallery was dead silent now, all eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The corporate lawyers had stopped pretending to be disinterested, their faces showing the first hints of genuine concern. Judge Mallory sat rigid in his chair, his authority challenged in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Elena's quiet dignity seemed to fill the courtroom, making her borrowed blazer and messy bun irrelevant. She stood straighter, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm prepared to present my evidence, Your Honor. The only question is whether you're prepared to actually hear it." The recess couldn't have come at a better time. Elena's hands were still shaking as she stepped out of the courtroom, though now it was more from adrenaline than fear. The hallway buzzed with whispered conversations, and she could feel eyes following her as she made her way to the water fountain. "Ms. Reyes?" The voice was unfamiliar, but the tone was something she hadn't heard all morning: respect. She turned to find a tall man in a charcoal suit, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him an academic air. Behind him stood a younger woman in a crisp pantsuit, holding a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. "I'm Dr. James Morrison," the man said, extending his hand. "Your environmental expert witness. Though I have to say, you're handling yourself quite well without me." Elena felt her breath catch. She'd submitted Dr. Morrison's preliminary report as part of her evidence, but she hadn't expected him to show up in person. His reputation in environmental science made him more likely to testify before Congress than a local court. Dr. Morrison, I didn't think you'd come. Elena managed to keep her voice steady, though her heart was racing. Your report was more than generous. Generous? He chuckled, shaking his head. Ms. Reyes, your research is some of the most thorough I've seen in years. Amateur detective work, the judge called it. I've seen doctoral theses with less rigorous methodology. The woman beside him stepped forward, offering her own hand. Sarah Chun, from Martinez and Associates. Your friend Carmen called our office this morning. She was concerned about how this hearing might go. Elena remembered Carmen's words from last night. I know you want to do this yourself, but promise me you'll let me call in some help if things get ugly. She hadn't expected Carmen to actually do it. I appreciate the thought, Elena said carefully, but I can't afford. Pro bono, Sarah interrupted, a small smile playing at her lips. Consider it our contribution to environmental justice. Besides, after watching that display in there, she gestured toward the courtroom. Let's just say I haven't seen anyone stand up to Judge Mallory like that in years. It's about time someone did. Dr. Morrison nodded, pulling a folder from his briefcase. I brought my complete findings, not just the preliminary report. The contamination patterns you identified? They're not just concerning, they're damning. Clayton Industries has been using banned chemicals in their manufacturing process, chemicals that were outlawed in most countries decades ago. Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she'd been carrying for months. She wasn't alone anymore. Her evidence wasn't just amateur detective work. Her community's suffering wasn't just paranoia or coincidence. The judge, she started, but Sarah cut her off with a wave. Judge Mallory has a history, she said, pulling out her phone. I've already contacted several colleagues who've dealt with him before. His bias against pro-SE litigants is well documented, and his handling of environmental cases, she looked up, her eyes sharp. Let's just say there might be some interesting questions about his previous rulings in similar cases. Down the hallway, the Clayton Industries lawyers huddled near a window, their earlier confidence noticeably dimmed. They kept glancing in Elena's direction, especially at her new companions. Dr. Morrison's presence hadn't gone unnoticed. His testimony had shut down polluters in 3 different states. They'll try to settle, Sarah said quietly, following Elena's gaze. As soon as they realize who's involved now, they'll want to bury this as quickly as possible. But that's not what you're after, is it? Elena thought about Mrs. Chen's withered garden, about Mr. Rodriguez's kids who couldn't play outside anymore, about all the families who'd trusted her to be their voice. No, she said firmly. This isn't about money. It's about making them stop. Dr. Morrison smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd been hoping for that answer. Then let's give them something they can't bury. My team has been analyzing soil samples from similar sites across the state. The pattern of contamination matches exactly what you found in your neighborhood. This isn't an isolated incident. It's corporate policy. Sarah was already making notes on her tablet. We can file for an immediate injunction. With Dr. Morrison's testimony and your documentation, we can force them to suspend operations until a full environmental impact study is completed. The courthouse hallway had grown quieter, the regular crowd of lawyers and clients thinning out during the recess. But there was an energy building around their small group, a sense of momentum that hadn't existed an hour ago. Ms. Reyes. A court clerk approached, looking nervous. Judge Mallory would like to resume in 5 minutes. Sarah straightened, smoothing her jacket. Ready to go back in? Elena looked at her borrowed blazer, suddenly feeling less self-conscious about it. Actually, would you mind if I still took the lead? At least for now. Dr. Morrison and Sarah exchanged glances, then both smiled. It's your case, Ms. Reyes, Sarah said. We're just here to make sure everyone else realizes what you already know, that you've got them dead to rights. They gathered their materials, Sarah quickly explaining how they'd proceed. The Clayton lawyers watched them warily, their phones pressed to their ears as they presumably updated their superiors about the changing situation. As they approached the courtroom doors, Elena felt a different kind of nervousness now. Not the fear of being dismissed, but the weight of responsibility. She had real allies now, experts who validated what she'd been fighting to prove. But more importantly, she had the truth on her side, documented and ready to be heard. "One more thing," Sarah whispered as they waited to enter. "Judge Mallory's going to hate this, but every word from this point on is being transcribed by our office. His bias might have gone unchecked before, but not today." Elena nodded, squaring her shoulders. She thought about all the nights spent gathering evidence, all the community meetings in living rooms and church basements, all the people who trusted her to fight for them. The borrowed blazer didn't matter. The judge's prejudice didn't matter. What mattered was that, finally, someone would have to listen. The bailiff opened the doors, and they walked in together. The young woman in the borrowed blazer, the renowned environmental expert, and the lawyer who'd chosen to fight for justice instead of billable hours. The gallery, which had thinned during recess, suddenly seemed fuller. Word had spread about what was happening in courtroom 3, and no one wanted to miss what came next. Judge Mallory's face remained impassive as they filed back into the courtroom, though his eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of Dr. Morrison and Sarah. He'd been a judge long enough to recognize when a case was shifting out of his control. The familiar weight of his robe suddenly felt heavier on his shoulders. "Your Honor," Elena began, but before she could continue, his clerk hurried up to the bench, a yellow post-it note clutched in his hand. Tim's face was flushed, his usual composure rattled as he handed over the note. The courtroom fell silent, watching as Judge Mallory read the message. His expression shifted subtly, a slight widening of the eyes, a tightening around the mouth. He looked up at Elena again, really looking at her for the first time that day. "Ms. Reyes," he said, his voice carrying a new note of uncertainty. "Perhaps we should discuss your credentials before proceeding. I understand you have some background in environmental law." Elena kept her expression neutral, though she could feel Sarah trying to hide a smile beside her. "Yes, Your Honor. I completed my master's thesis on corporate environmental accountability at Yale. It focused specifically on community-led documentation of industrial pollution." The Clayton lawyers stirred uneasily. The oldest one was furiously typing on his phone, probably doing the same background check that had prompted Tim's note. "I see," Judge Mallory said slowly. His fingers drummed against his desk, a nervous habit he'd never quite shaken. "And your father, he wouldn't happen to be Senator Michael Reyes?" A murmur rippled through the gallery. Elena had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come eventually. She deliberately left her father's name off all the paperwork, wanting her evidence to stand on its own merits. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Though I prefer if we could focus on the evidence I've presented rather than my family connections." Judge Mallory shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. The morning's dismissive attitude had vanished, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Senator Reyes chaired the Judicial Oversight Committee, a fact that every judge in the state knew well. Of course," he said quickly, shuffling papers on his desk with unusual energy. "Please, continue with your presentation. I believe you were about to discuss the environmental impact studies." The Clayton lawyers were in full panic mode now, their phones lighting up with messages. The youngest one looked like he might be sick. They'd probably run a background check before the hearing, but Elena had gotten married right after college and changed her name. Her divorce last year had brought back her maiden name, a detail that hadn't made it into their preliminary research. The change in the courtroom's atmosphere was almost physical. Where before there had been dismissive glances and barely hidden smirks, now there was rapt attention. Judge Mallory's face had taken on the slightly gray tinge of someone who suddenly realized they'd been playing with matches in a room full of dynamite. "If I may, Your Honor," Elena continued, her voice steady, "I'd like to return to the evidence you previously dismissed as amateur research." Yes, certainly," Judge Mallory nodded, now leaning forward with exaggerated interest. "Please, take all the time you need to present your findings." The corporate lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently. Their carefully planned strategy of dismissal and delay was crumbling around them. The oldest one kept glancing between Elena and Judge Mallory, probably calculating the political fallout of their previous tactics. Elena opened her folder, the same one Judge Mallory had barely glanced at earlier. As I was trying to explain before, we've documented a clear pattern of environmental violations. Dr. Morrison, would you like to speak to your findings? Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his academic presence adding another layer of gravitas to the proceedings. Your Honor, I've reviewed Ms. Reyes's research extensively. Her methodology is impeccable, and her findings are, quite frankly, alarming. Judge Mallory nodded enthusiastically, as if he hadn't spent the morning trying to prevent this very testimony. Please, Doctor, tell us more. The court is very interested in your expert opinion. Sarah Chin sat quietly beside Elena, her tablet recording every word, every sudden change in judicial attitude. Her slight smile suggested she was already drafting some interesting memos about today's proceedings. The gallery had grown fuller, with lawyers from other courtrooms slipping in to watch. Word had spread quickly. The daughter of Senator Reyes, the chair of the Judicial Oversight Committee, had been nearly thrown out of court by Judge Mallory. It was the kind of story that would spread through legal circles like wildfire. Your Honor, the lead Clayton lawyer stood up, his confidence replaced by desperate damage control. Perhaps we could take a brief recess to discuss a possible settlement. Judge Mallory looked like he wanted to agree. Anything to end this increasingly dangerous situation, but Elena spoke first. No, she said firmly. This isn't about reaching a private settlement. This is about a systemic problem that needs to be addressed publicly. She turned to face the corporate lawyers directly. Your company has been poisoning my community, and we have the evidence to prove it. That evidence deserves to be heard in open court. The judge's face went through a complex series of expressions: fear, resignation, and finally a desperate attempt at judicial authority. Yes, quite right, he managed. The court will hear all evidence in this matter. Ms. Reyes, please proceed with your full presentation. Elena glanced at Sarah, who gave her a slight nod. They both knew what was happening. Judge Mallory was trying to cover his tracks, to erase his morning's behavior with sudden cooperation. But it was too late. The transcript of his earlier dismissals was already being circulated to interested parties. The morning's power dynamic had completely reversed. Now it was Judge Mallory who seemed small and uncertain, while Elena stood tall, her borrowed blazer and messy bun no longer relevant to anyone's assessment of her capabilities. A paper airplane would have sounded like thunder in the silent courtroom as Elena began her presentation again, this time without interruption. Every person present knew they were watching something significant, not just the exposure of corporate wrongdoing, but the crumbling of judicial prejudice under the weight of its own assumptions. During the lunch recess, Judge Mallory sat alone in his chambers, his half-eaten sandwich forgotten on his desk. His computer screen showed Elena Reyes's complete background: Yale Law Review, Environmental Justice Fellowships, published papers on community-driven accountability in corporate pollution cases. How had he missed this? A knock on his door made him jump. "Come in," he called, quickly closing the browser tab. Tim entered, looking uncomfortable. "Your Honor, there are several reporters asking for comment about this morning's proceedings." Of course there were. Mallory's stomach churned. "Tell them no comment." "And Tim, what exactly is being said?" "Sir, it's all over the courthouse. Someone recorded parts of the morning session on their phone. Social media." Tim trailed off, then added quietly, "The video of you dismissing Ms. Reyes's evidence has already gone viral in legal circles." Mallory loosened his collar, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed world starting to crack. Back in the courtroom, he could hear voices through the door, more people filing in, drawn by the growing buzz about what was happening in Courtroom 3. Meanwhile, in a small conference room down the hall, Elena sat with her unexpected legal team. Sarah Chun was directing a small army of junior associates via text, while Dr. Morrison reviewed his testimony notes. "He's going to try to backpedal," Sarah said, looking up from her phone. "Probably bend over backward to seem fair now. But we have the morning's transcript, and 3 different witnesses have already submitted affidavits about his behavior." Elena nodded, picking at her own untouched lunch. "I don't want this to just be about Judge Mallory. The real issue is still Clayton Industries and what they're doing to our community. Don't worry, Dr. Morrison said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "I've compiled similar cases from across the state. Your community isn't the first one they've poisoned, but if we play this right, they might be the last." Back in the courtroom, the Clayton lawyers huddled with their client, a nervous-looking executive who'd been summoned from the corporate headquarters after the morning's disaster. Their whispered conversation was tense, hands gesturing sharply as they argued about strategy. "We can't risk this going public," the executive hissed, loud enough for nearby observers to hear. "The EPA's already sniffing around 3 of our other facilities." The lead lawyer shook his head. "It's too late for that. Look around. Every environmental reporter in the city is here now." And with Senator Reyes's daughter involved, the gallery had indeed filled up during lunch. Legal interns sat shoulder to shoulder with environmental activists. Local reporters scribbled in notepads, while worried-looking courthouse administrators whispered in corners. When court resumed, Judge Mallory's attempt at a fresh start was painful to watch. His typical bored expression had been replaced by an almost manic attentiveness, nodding enthusiastically at every piece of evidence Elena presented. "And if you'll look at Exhibit C, Your Honor," Elena continued, her voice steady as she pointed to the contamination map, "you'll see the spread of pollutants follows the groundwater flow exactly as Dr. Morrison predicted." "Fascinating," Mallory said, leaning forward with exaggerated interest. "Please, tell us more about your methodology." The Clayton lawyers squirmed in their seats, watching their usual tactics of delay and dismissal crumble. Their client, the corporate executive, had gone from angry to pale as the evidence mounted. Sarah Chin sat quietly beside Elena, her tablet recording everything. Occasionally, she glanced at her phone, where messages from colleagues around the state kept arriving. Other cases, other communities, other judges who dismissed similar evidence without a hearing. During Elena's presentation of health impact data, Judge Mallory's clerk appeared with another note. The judge's hands shook slightly as he read it. More reporters had arrived. Someone from the Judicial Review Board was in the building. Senator Reyes's office had called, asking for transcripts of the morning's proceedings. "Your Honor," the lead Clayton lawyer stood up, sweat visible on his forehead. "In light of this compelling presentation, we'd like to propose an immediate suspension of operations pending further investigation." But Elena wasn't done. She pulled out another folder, medical records, soil samples, expert analyses. Each piece of evidence she'd tried to present that morning, each document Judge Mallory had dismissed without reading, now laid bare before a packed courtroom. "The damage isn't limited to our community," she explained, her quiet voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "We've found similar patterns in other neighborhoods, other cities. The same chemicals, the same health issues, the same corporate denials." The corporate executive was typing frantically on his phone now, probably trying to manage the PR disaster unfolding in real time. Judge Mallory kept glancing at his chamber doors, as if expecting judicial review officers to burst in at any moment. Sarah finally stood up, her professional calm a sharp contrast to the tension in the room. "Your Honor, given the systemic nature of these violations, we're requesting not just an injunction against Clayton Industries, but a full review of all similar cases that have come before this court." The implications hung in the air like smoke. How many other cases had been dismissed without a proper hearing? How many other communities had been silenced by judicial prejudice and corporate power? Judge Mallory's face had taken on a waxy sheen. "Yes, well, that seems appropriate." His voice had lost its morning's authority, replaced by something close to fear. Elena looked around the courtroom, at the reporters scribbling notes, the activists filming on their phones, the corporate lawyers in their crumbling tower of privilege. The borrowed blazer that had seemed so important this morning now felt like a costume she no longer needed. The truth was out, not just about Clayton Industries, but about the system that had protected them. Judge Mallory's bias had been exposed, not through angry confrontation, but through the quiet persistence of evidence he'd tried to dismiss. By Friday morning, Judge Mallory's courtroom sat empty. A printed notice on the door announced all his cases had been temporarily reassigned pending review. Inside his chambers, he stared at his phone, reading the latest news headlines for the 100th time. Judge faces investigation over bias claims in environmental case. Senator's daughter exposes judicial prejudice in Clayton Industries hearing, pattern of dismissals. Review board examines judge's environmental case history. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. The past 3 days had been a blur of meetings with court administrators, calls from concerned colleagues, and increasingly urgent messages from his lawyer. Everything he'd built over 23 years was unraveling like a cheap sweater. Down the hall, in a larger courtroom, Elena's case continued under Judge Patricia Martinez, known for her meticulous attention to detail and unwavering fairness. The contrast couldn't have been starker. The court has reviewed all evidence previously submitted, Judge Martinez announced, her reading glasses perched firmly on her nose. Including those materials initially dismissed in Monday's hearing. She didn't need to mention Mallory by name. Everyone knew what she meant. The Clayton Industries team had doubled in size, now occupying 3 tables with their legal staff and corporate representatives. Their initial dismissive attitude had been replaced by grim determination as they realized the full scope of what they were facing. Sarah Chen's team had grown too. Environmental lawyers from 3 different firms had joined the case, each bringing evidence of similar violations in other communities. Dr. Morrison's preliminary findings had sparked a wave of independent investigations, with more data arriving daily. What started as a local complaint has revealed a pattern of systematic environmental violations, Judge Martinez continued. More concerning is the pattern of judicial oversight that allowed these violations to continue unchecked. In his chambers, Mallory clicked on another news article. This one featured interviews with previous plaintiffs who'd appeared before him, other environmental cases he dismissed, other evidence he'd ignored. Each story reinforced the same pattern of bias he displayed with Elena. His phone buzzed, another message from the Judicial Review Board. They wanted to discuss his cases from the past 5 years, particularly those involving corporate defendants and pro-SE plaintiffs. The knot in his stomach tightened. The courthouse corridors buzzed with activity as more cases were pulled for review. Judge Mallory's bias hadn't existed in a vacuum. It had affected real people, real communities, real lives. Each dismissed case represented someone who'd been denied justice, someone whose evidence never got a fair hearing. We're reviewing every environmental case that came before him, a judicial administrator explained to a room full of reporters. Any plaintiff whose case was dismissed without proper consideration will have the opportunity for a new hearing. In Judge Martinez's courtroom, Elena sat with her growing legal team, watching as Clayton Industries lawyers attempted to explain away years of environmental violations. Their previous confidence had evaporated, replaced by desperate damage control. Your Honor, their lead counsel argued, we propose an immediate settlement including full cleanup costs and community health monitoring. But Judge Martinez wasn't interested in quick fixes. This court's primary concern is not just remediation, but prevention. We need to understand how these violations continued for so long without proper oversight. The answer, of course, lay partly in Judge Mallory's empty courtroom. His bias had provided corporate defendants with a shield, his dismissive attitude a tool for maintaining the status quo. Now that shield had cracked, exposing not just corporate misconduct but systemic judicial failure. Back in his chambers, Mallory found himself looking at old case files with new eyes. How many times had he dismissed evidence without really looking at it? How many times had he assumed he knew what kind of case it was, what kind of person the plaintiff was, before they'd even spoken? His computer pinged with another email, this one from the State Bar Association. They were launching their own investigation into patterns of judicial conduct in environmental cases. Mallory's case wasn't unique. It had just been the one that finally broke through. The media attention had spread beyond local news now. National papers were picking up the story, not just about Clayton Industries violations, but about the broader issue of judicial bias in environmental cases. Mallory's name had become synonymous with a system that favored corporate interests over community welfare. It was never personal, he muttered to his empty office, but the words rang hollow. It had been personal bias, personal assumptions, personal failure to uphold the principles he'd sworn to protect. The sky outside his window was growing dark, another day ending in a week that had shattered his world. On his desk, another stack of case files waited for review. Years of decisions now suspect. Years of dismissals that might have allowed corporate pollution to continue unchecked. His phone buzzed one final time. The message was brief. The Judicial Review Board wanted to see him first thing Monday morning. They had questions about his pattern of dismissals, his treatment of pro-SE plaintiffs, his handling of environmental cases. Many questions. Judge Mallory switched off his office light, his shadow long against the wall. 23 years on the bench, and it had taken Elena Reyes's quiet persistence to expose what he'd become, not a guardian of justice, but a barrier to it. 6 months later, the nameplate on courtroom 3 read Judge Maria Santos. The room itself looked the same wooden benches, same fluorescent lights, same American flag beside the bench. But everything else had changed. Where Judge Mallory's court had been a place of swift dismissals and foregone conclusions, Judge Santos's courtroom moved at a different pace. She listened. She asked questions. She gave every case, every person, the attention they deserved. Next case, she called, her voice carrying none of the weariness that had characterized her predecessors. The bailiff opened the doors, letting in a group of community members from the city's west side. They carried folders of evidence about another company's environmental violations. In the gallery, Elena sat quietly, watching. She came to court sometimes, not to speak, but to observe the changes her case had sparked. Her borrowed blazer had been replaced by a well-fitted suit, but she still carried the same leather bag, now worn at the edges from months of use. The Clayton Industries case had ended not with a quiet settlement, but with a comprehensive judgment. The company had been forced to cease operations until they could prove compliance with environmental regulations. The cleanup effort in Elena's neighborhood was already showing results. Gardens were growing again. Children were playing outside. The air smelled clean. But the bigger changes had happened in the courthouse itself. Judge Mallory's early retirement had triggered a review of judicial conduct across the state. Other judges had faced scrutiny over their handling of environmental cases, their treatment of pro-SE plaintiffs, their assumptions about who deserved to be heard. Sarah Chen's law firm had set up a special unit dedicated to reviewing dismissed environmental cases. They'd found patterns similar to Elena's case. Evidence ignored, complaints dismissed, communities silenced. One by one, these cases were being reopened, reheard, reconsidered. Dr. Morrison's findings had sparked a statewide investigation into corporate pollution. Other communities, emboldened by Elena's success, had started documenting their own evidence. The methodologies she developed were being taught in workshops, shared between neighborhoods, passed from one concerned citizen to another. The case before Judge Santos continued, each piece of evidence carefully considered, each witness given time to speak. The corporate lawyers at the defense table looked different too. Gone was the casual dismissiveness, replaced by careful attention. They'd learned the hard way that community evidence couldn't be ignored anymore. During a break, Elena stepped out into the courthouse hallway. The bulletin board that had once held standard legal notices now included information about environmental rights, guides for pro-SE litigants, contact information for advocacy groups. Small changes, but meaningful ones. She passed Judge Mallory's old chambers, now occupied by a young judge who'd made her reputation fighting for environmental justice. Through the open door, Elena could see community members meeting with the judge's staff, discussing their concerns, being heard. The Clayton Industries case had become required reading in law schools, not just for its environmental implications, but as a study in judicial bias and systemic change. Elena had been invited to speak at several universities, sharing her story not as a victim of prejudice, but as an agent of transformation. Her phone buzzed, a message from Sarah. Another judge in another state had been called out for dismissing environmental evidence without a hearing. The local advocates had cited Elena's case in their complaint. The ripples were still spreading. Outside the courthouse, new trees had been planted along the street, their leaves turning golden in the autumn light. The old bench where she'd practiced her arguments still stood, now often occupied by others preparing their cases, fighting their own battles. Judge Mallory had left town shortly after his retirement, but his legacy remained, not as he'd planned, but as a reminder of how justice could fail when prejudice went unchecked. His case files had become a training tool for new judges, teaching them what not to do, how not to be. In Judge Santos's courtroom, the afternoon session was beginning. Elena watched as more people filed in: community members, corporate representatives, lawyers on both sides. The power dynamics had shifted. Now everyone knew that evidence couldn't be dismissed with a wave of the hand, that every voice deserved to be heard. A young woman in a slightly too big blazer caught Elena's eye as she entered the courtroom. She carried a folder full of evidence about water contamination in her neighborhood. Elena smiled, remembering herself 6 months ago. But this woman wouldn't face the same dismissive treatment, wouldn't have to fight just to be heard. The system hadn't been completely fixed, no single case could do that. But it had been cracked open, exposed, forced to look at itself. And in that exposure, something new had begun to grow, a justice system that looked more like justice, a courtroom where evidence mattered more than assumptions, a legal process that served the many instead of the few. Elena gathered her things, ready to leave. She had her own work to continue, other communities to help, other evidence to gather, other battles to fight. But she left knowing that this courthouse, at least, had changed. And change, once started, had a way of spreading, one case, one courtroom, one judge at a time. That was the real victory, not just winning her case, but transforming the system that had tried to silence her. The borrowed blazer and messy bun were part of her story now, but they weren't the whole story. The whole story was written in changed laws, reformed procedures, and most importantly, in the faces of people who now knew they had a right to be heard. The end.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.